Hi there, I'm Mr. Ridgway, and welcome to another episode of Ridgway History. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 1950s and the things that we commonly associate with it. Everything from suburbia to the Big Mac to anti-feminism. So let's take a look at that and get going. So when most people think of the 1950s, both in terms of at home and abroad, what should come to mind, and what did for most people, was the Cold War. Pretty much the Cold War, in terms of the 1950s, really defined the American experience. And again, the Cold War is that gigantic conflict of both ideals and economics and people and politics between the US and the Soviet Union from about you could say probably from 1945 all the way up until the early 1990s. But by the time that the year 1950 comes along, even a lot has changed since the end of the Second World War. Both now the United States and the Soviet Union have nuclear bombs, so meaning that the possibility could occur of MAD, which was mutually assured destruction, meaning that both the United States and the Soviet Union were capable of possibly destroying each other completely and totally at any moment. Not only that, the Korean War has also started, and the UN has now sent a force over there, which included the US. But the US has now started to pursue an overseas policy of actually trying to contain communism, as explained by the domino theory that we've discussed a few classes before. When we say that the Cold War really defined the American experience, we mean that at home, everything is kind of thought about in kind of this kind of cultural continuum where when, for example, like we here in the United States today, a lot of the ideas and a lot of language that we use on an everyday basis is often phrased around terrorism or national security, things that have come because of the events of 9/11. But here in the Cold War, it's very, very similar. So when the United States starts to move along as a cultural and as a cultural force and as a society in the 1950s, their experience is really defined by this larger picture of the threat of communism. And many Americans thought that communism really was the greatest challenge that the U.S. had ever faced. So starting with the Civil War back in the 1860s, and then the Germans the first time, the Germans the second time, and then now communism was kind of the United States' next challenge. So how does the Cold War really shape the American experience? Overwhelmingly, most historians tend to agree that what the Cold War promoted was a culture of conformity, where not only individual Americans, but then also the government and society at large really tried to push Americans towards a kind of singular defined experience. And so, with the challenge of communism in mind and the Cold War kind of as a backdrop, the US government and mass culture in the United States really doesn't have a whole lot of toleration for dissent at home, because simply battling the forces of communism, you want to present a united front. You don't want to seem divided when there's a big, big challenge, economically, politically, etc., knocking at your door, and that you were under threat from on a pretty much constant basis. So what did culture look like? It emphasized unity and patriotism, and this was seen across society. So everything from journalism to the books that historians put on the shelves to what was available in supermarkets and grocery stores, everything was kind of driving towards this culture of conformity where you wanted things to be kind of similar. And so what we're going to look at here today are or at least the idea of conformity in terms of both moral and material goods. So moral conformity. So here we're looking at kind of beliefs and ideology. So in the government, when the 1950s happened, there's an even more intense Red Scare, mostly led by this man in the larger picture, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, which he now is given quite appropriately the title of McCarthyism, when you suspect people and you kind of go on a witch hunt for ideas. And what he does is he goes after and targets, apparently on these very long lists he had, of supposed American communists and people that were trying to overthrow the US. He also, kind of what the greatest sign of this kind of cultural kind of conformity in the government was McCarthy's House on Un-American Activities Committee, which he actually didn't create. It had actually been there in the United States government as far back as 1938. But McCarthy is really the guy who takes it to a whole new height, and then eventually to, well, depending on how you saw it, a whole new depth. But it wasn't just government, it was also religion. So you see a lot of pastors and preachers come along that really kind of help revitalize the American religious experience. And so you see church membership in the United States grow quite significantly. You see the idea that having Americans unified in a all-powerful, monotheistic religion that believes in God is really, really important. So we see actually the first televangelists come along, and they become incredibly, incredibly powerful, such as Billy Graham, who's actually still alive to this very day, as of 2017. On the material side of things, we'll kind of take a moment to look at both the home and the workplace. So on the home front sort of things in the Cold War, we kind of see, broadly speaking, that the idea of the American dream becomes really, really standardized. So not just in home design, such as the neighborhoods in Levittown, but then also the idea that Americans needed to buy comfort items that really could be found in homes all across the United States. Now, a lot of this money comes from a kind of post-war economic boom, but what generally happens is that Americans take that money, turn it around, and you see this kind of like standardized purchasing of lots of kind of what we consider to be like traditional American things. So for example, home ownership, or refrigerators, cars, all the way to lawnmowers, dogs, etc. Also, in terms of homes, you see that gender roles also become much more strictly redefined after the World War II saga. And so even the females that had an opportunity to go and work in factories after the Second World War really are largely shoved out of that space rather forcibly after the war, and many are kind of pushed into this domestic housewife kind of role. So things that we associate now with kind of like the jokes that we hear, or the kind of sometimes references that we hear about women being in kitchens and those kind of things, really does trace its time all the way back to the 1950s here, where we see the reintegration of the idea of separate spheres. In work, corporations become even more powerful. We see jobs becoming more standardized, kind of like the typical kind of like 9-to-5s, except you're oftentimes now in cubicles. So even that experience, the work experience itself, is even more kind of standardized. For the first time in the late, actually, 1950s, white-collar jobs actually become more prevalent in the United States than blue-collar jobs. And not only that, but even in the workplace, separate spheres come back again. So you'll typically see men doing quite different work than the women that oftentimes may work in the same workplace. And even then, the ideas of the responsibilities that are given to women and how women are treated in the workplace is also very different too. But what it's kind of all pushing to in terms of materials is that you have this kind of very kind of like monolithic, or at least what historians can look at and point to as a very kind of like monolithic American kind of material ownership, which does have a lot of consequences. And so when we look at morals and materials and kind of the conformity they're going through these things, one really important thing for us to do, and kind of the question that I'll leave you with, is first, is this the experience of all Americans, which it certainly is not, and there's definitely some other windows in the 1950s that we have. And then second, if we accept this as one view, how prevalent is it, like we asked before, but then why is it so prevalent? And then also, how does this change society, or how will there be resistance or modifications to this in the future? And you'll see that our baby boomers, who are born during this time, by the time the 60s and the 70s come about, they'll have a very kind of different response to this kind of monolithic cultural kind of conformity that's been really pushed on them since their childhood. And so, with that, I will leave you, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.